Okay. Can you hear me? I'm probably don't even need to speak in the mic, but maybe for the people online. Welcome to the Zoom community. We are having a little bit of a late start today because of the Mother's Day celebration that's going on in Fellowship Hall with the new cappuccino maker. So there's lots of people getting coffee today. And we're going to go ahead and start now. We welcome Dr. Jim Hudnut-Boimler today for his second in a series of classes on his book that he's writing, The Moral Crisis in American Christianity, Am I My Brother's Keeper? Last week we talked about Am I My Brother's Keeper? And today he is discussing Meeting the Moral Crisis in American Christianity, Who is My Neighbor? So thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Susan. I've already passed the first test. I got through all the wires. And hello, anybody who's watching in on Zoom. Come on. Yeah. So today's talk is about solving the moral crisis in contemporary American Christianity by returning to a question that Jesus answers repeatedly, and it's who is my neighbor? And obviously, it's a question that has resonance through the Jewish community that becomes the Christian community. It still has resonance today, and I'm going to argue that it's the key to any solution of the moral crisis that I described 2 weeks ago. So, in case you weren't here with us before, I'm going to talk a little bit about resetting the stage of what we're talking about. I'm using a lens of responsibility. Now, responsibility is an Enlightenment era word, but biblical people, Romans, Greeks, talked about duty, talked about obligations, religious obligations, social obligations, and so forth. But for our purposes, it's useful to talk about responsibility because it's a term that we use in the law, it's a term we use in religion, it's a term we use in our families. And the question we're asking is, what do the various believers, and here we're confining ourselves to Christians, even though we know we're 75% of Americans are self-identified Christians. And so the large groups are both part of the problem and part of the solution. What do the various believers claim as their responsibility or duty or obligation to others? And I came up with a graphic to talk about what we talked about in the last class, which is the relationship between personal responsibility, social responsibility, and collective responsibility as ever enlarging circles. As I said before, we all grew up with personal responsibility. Our parents told us not to do certain things or there would be consequences. We probably have told our children about personal responsibility and the importance of that. Social responsibility is when you begin to look beyond the family circle to people that you're engaged in professional responsibilities, school responsibilities, playground responsibilities, and so forth. Maybe even as large as a whole country. When you get to collective responsibility, you're getting to the things that none of us can make much of a dent in individually. And the example I used before was climate change. I can't personally by my personal actions, stop climate change, but perhaps we all can together turn the distance to that. And then I said 4 major families, and these are the numerically largest families of American Christianity: evangelicals and mainline or ecumenical Protestants, that includes us, Roman Catholics and Black church Protestants and Pentecostals have some takes on what kind of responsibility is most important. Yeah.
What about LDS church? Where does it fit into?
Okay, so I'd be happy to add the LDS right now, if you wish. So let's talk about the evangelicals. Part of what's going on with the evangelicals is very, very strong sense of personal responsibility and almost blinders about what you would do as a state, unless it's a prohibition that it enforces a personal responsibility. So we're seeing in the abortion matter, not trusting people to do their own personal responsibility with respect to abortion, but we're going to enforce that in Texas and Mississippi and what have you. Why is that? Well, the evangelical social horizon is almost a night watchman state. We have to keep people from doing stuff, but the good stuff that people do, they all do at a personal level. Just like Jesus Christ is my personal Lord and Savior, my moral conduct as a Christian is and should be, and so should yours, be at the personal level. Mainline or ecumenical Protestants who descended out of the Reformation and had a larger sense of statecraft tend now in their eclipse. So the evangelicals are twice as large as the ecumenical Protestants now. The ecumenical Protestants, used to have control of the Supreme Court and the Congress and the presidency, except for the 2 times we had Unitarians. And in many ways, the Unitarians were honorary ecumenical Protestants back then, had a larger sense of social responsibility. They still do. They tend, though, to look with green eyes, with some jealousy towards the evangelicals and say, that's not our Christianity. Our Christianity is social and perhaps underemphasize personal responsibility. The Roman Catholics and the Black church Christians are divided. So you have a division between, on the one hand, personal responsibility Catholics who loved Pope John Paul II, and the social responsibility Catholics who love Pope Francis. Okay, and Pope Francis, of course, and Vatican II, Pope John the 23rd, were big into collective responsibility and making common cause. So the Protestants are fractured, the white Protestants are fractured, the Catholics are fractured, the Black church is fractured between personal responsibility, which is still very strong and preached strongly in traditional, AME, American and National Baptist churches, and a kind of along with that, a strong social responsibility and collective responsibility that is a long tail of the civil rights movement of the Black church. But you've also got a fairly narrow, self-regarding, it's all about us Christians getting our stuff in the prosperity gospel. Now, Susan asked about the LDS, and the Latter-day Saints would be the next largest group we have of all Christians, they would have a very, very strong sense of social, personal responsibility, tight moral ethic, including, don't drink the coffee, and certain proscriptions and prescriptions and family favorite thing. They take care of their own. So in every ward, you have a bishop's closet. The bishop's closet is both food, and it could be money for rent. They have a social responsibility, but you got to be in the LDS church to be part of that. Okay? So it gets directly to the question of who is my neighbor. And before we go into that, Ken Handy talked to me about his reading and said, I know you're doing modern, but haven't Christians been pretty rough with each other through the centuries? So let's take a quick tour. This is a depiction of the first crusade. There were 8 crusades to try to retake the Holy Land with decreased success over the 8 crusades from 1095 till 1291. And let's go on to another instance of what Christians did with some of their neighbors, or how they construed who their neighbor was. This is a picture of the expulsion of the Moors, which took place between 1609 and 1614. And we probably also should call it the expulsion of the Moroscos, because in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella got to take over Grenada. So they were no longer Muslims in control, and part of the deal was you had to convert or leave. Jews and Muslims had to convert or leave. So for the next 100 years, Jews converted, Muslims converted, and the Inquisition arose in part out of the fear that people weren't really converted. And at the end of 100 years, the Moroscos, the Moors who had converted to Christianity, who were distrusted and still had dark skin and what have you, are kicked out of all of Spain. Again, this is Christians with, somewhat like us, Christians in control of a society, in control of its laws, who are armed, who have the agency of force. Maybe a little closer to our ethnic stock and some of us. This is a depiction of, this is a detail from a large canvas detailing the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. And it was going to be this great event where the Protestant Henry marries, who was Calvinist, who was going to marry Margaret, the king's sister, and bring together the Catholics and the Protestants. And what happens instead is the fact that all of these Protestants, Huguenots, are in town for the marriage. They come up with a plan to kill the leading Protestants and deal with their interreligious dialogue problem. And the woman in black there is Catherine de' Medici. And finally, we come to America, and this is a depiction in 1660 in Puritan Boston of the execution, or leading up to the execution of Mary Dyer, a Quaker who just wouldn't shut up about her Quaker stuff. So the Puritans are religiously about as close as you can get to the Presbyterian origin. They think they're going to make a great Christian society, what they call the godly society, and they have a tolerance problem. And it doesn't stop in the neighborhood of Boston. This is a depiction of the ruins of the Ursuline convent, which were burned because the Protestants heard all kinds of awful rumors about what happened inside convents in 1834 and decided to do something about it, which was to burn it down. And that this pastoral picture with this burned out convent is actually from the same year. Somebody engraved it as kind of a news item so that they could print the engraved item in papers. So, what is wrong with these pictures? It's an open question. Anybody? A lot of death. Intolerance, yeah. What do we learn? Very different opinions as to who's our neighbor and where our responsibility stops. Anything else? I had all those in mind. I have one more, which is that Christians with weapons don't become better people. But just because they have the means of enforcing things on other people at the point of a sword, a halberd, a gun, fire, Christians are capable of being just as dangerous as anybody else. And maybe a little more insofar as that if you think you have God on your side. We have in our family a little matchbook cover from World War I that says, it's got the Kaiser's helmet on it, and it says God mittens. And somehow the God with us in another language registers. So I want to talk today more biblically about three stories in which Jesus engages the question, who is my neighbor? And then two more stories in which it's enlarged a bit, and Jesus is discussing what are the consequences of not engaging in neighbor love. And just a reminder that Jesus gets his ideas honestly out of the tradition out of which he was raised. So Deuteronomy, Leviticus 19 says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now the I am the Lord is like an intensifier. God says this isn't optional, right? None of those folks who were exhibiting this Christian violence towards others, other Christians or Muslims or Jews, were buying. Yeah. So one of the interesting things you'll find if you spend time in Leviticus and in Exodus and in Deuteronomy is how much God is saying, in effect, you got your own land, you're in Canaan, but there are these strangers who will be among you, and and this means foreigners, right? And you need to treat them as you would treat yourself. Very hard lesson for people who've just come into power after having been in exile. So, yeah, that's pretty readable. First from Mark, because we think Mark is the earliest, and we'll treat Luke and Matthew as a toss-up. So you're probably familiar with this. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he, Jesus, answered them well, he asked him, which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The Shema, as it's known as a text. And then Jesus adds, the second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So love God, love neighbor, that's the package. And Jesus doesn't get in trouble with the scribe, because of course he has just said what everybody knows and most people fail to follow through on. We go to Luke. And the windup for this is, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus, according to Luke. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? And then the lawyer answers, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says to him, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. And so we see a progression of Luke telling the story. Mark tells a simple story. Matthew wraps it around with more meaning for the slightly later early Christians to understand the bite of this simple love God, love neighbor thing. But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Our question here, where does this neighbor thing start and stop? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of the robbers, who stripped him and beat him. And then Jesus tells the story that that's up here of the Good Samaritan. But it's also the story of people who didn't do certain things. So then he's asking his questioner, the lawyer, so which of these three, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan? And Samaritans, of course, are people they don't like from north of formal Israel. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The lawyer answers, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. So be like a Samaritan even though you're a Jew. Now this is pretty striking stuff, because it's enlarging this circle. Jesus didn't have PowerPoint, so he didn't have the aids to say, enlarge who you're considering your neighbor and who can be good. And then Matthew has a, Luke is speaking particularly to Christians who are poor and not so poor, probably to more Gentile Christians. Matthew has a more Jewish audience, probably centered around Jerusalem. He writes, same kind of story. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So, what do we get out of comparing these? Any things that occur to you? Yeah.
I think Matthew, the last line there, and I'm influenced a little bit by Frederick Beatner here, is he uses that last line as a lens to interpret anything else that comes out of the Bible or Christian tradition. Says these two commands, that's the base. Everything that you interpret needs to be interpreted.
Yeah. So some have called it the law of love. Christians ought to live by the law of love. The thing that's interesting about the Matthew version is it's not just the law, as we saw in an earlier version, but also the prophets, all the ethical teachings, all the sort of God says, don't do this anymore, Israel. God says you're in exile, but you can get out of exile. All those kinds of basically the prophets are always, and Jesus himself is maybe the last of the prophets for us, a call back to the kind of goodness of the law of love of God and love of neighbor. So yes, that's law of love language. What else? Anybody see anything they want to remark on? Okay, well then let's keep going. What's interesting about the Gospels is that there are also stories about people who do the right thing, like the Samaritan, and there are people who don't do the right thing. And here we see the same kind of teaching being registered in a different way back in Luke. A certain ruler asked Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother." And the man replies, "I have kept all these since my youth." When Jesus heard this, he said to him, "There is one thing still lacking. Sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." But when the man heard this, he became sad, for he was very rich. How does this change the same basic story? Yeah, so he says, "I've done it," but he's not prepared to do the next thing. And you know, Jesus is always a little bit, I heard a seminary professor describe this as Jesus is always counseling perfection. Not 7 times forgiveness, but 7 times 70. You know, it's kind of, it's impossible, but it's a gesture at how hard one ought to be working at something that one doesn't really want to work at. Anything else? Yeah, Susan.
I'm reminded of my Baptist relatives who would say, "I love the sinner and hate the sin," which I guess helps them think that they love their neighbor. But whatever their neighbor's doing that they don't like is a sin that they can't tolerate.
Right. So making a kind of a border between I love you, bless your heart, as Donovan said a couple of weeks ago. I love you, bless your heart. I just can't have your filthy addiction near my children. One of those kinds of things that is entailed in hate the sin. Okay, let's go to one more about those who do and those who don't. And you know this story, very long story. So when it's an eschatological story about where all of this neighbor love is going in the large scheme of one's life, large scheme of everybody's life. So Jesus tells this story about when the Son of Man comes in his glory. Then he will sit on the throne and judge the living and the dead and all nations. All nations. All nations means not just Jews, but the Romans and the Egyptians. And God is God of everybody. So this is a universal ethic. And he will judge them and sort them out like a shepherd sorts out sheep from goats. And goats, of course, are not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven in this analogy. And he will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to eat. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." And what do those people from the right side, on the sheep side of the divide, say? When did we do this? And he said, "Inasmuch as you have done it for any, the least of these, you have done it for me." So what does this do to this neighbor love story? It does what? It affirms it. It expands it. It makes it part of your whole life. It also makes it not just, I love Jesus so much, I do everything for Jesus. It's the inference is, you do this for everybody, you're doing it for Jesus.
It also raises the stakes. Now have, they want to be on the right hand of the Father, then they need to follow this principle, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that it says to me is, if all the nations are gathered before Jesus, it doesn't say that all the other nations, maybe you want Jesus' followers, if they follow this neighborly concept, do they go on the right side or the left side?
So that's open. Jesus is not here really gathering Christians, right? He's talking to other Jews who are Jesus followers, who haven't separated out and become Christians. But the Jewish people also, and you can look at Isaiah for this, you can look at Genesis for this, believe that their God is the God of everybody. And so these rules apply whether people have become part of the covenanted people of Israel or not. Now, people from outside the community might want to say, when did I sign up for this? But Christians and Jews at least have signed up for this in some way. So it makes you think. It raises it up. And notice that how much of this stuff is stuff we still have. We have prisons, we have people who are hungry, we have people who are sick. This is a description of responsibilities in both a negative and a positive way. If you do this, you live. If you don't, you don't.
That's right about this. One is, this is all personal and social. No sense like second is that money thing doesn't appear. So giving away all you can.
Yeah.
If you did, you couldn't provide food and clothing.
Right. So Jesus in another place has a treatment about korban, which is this custom of you get your mother if you're a male and your father dies or your mother-in-law is a widow, you get their wealth. And you say, I'm taking care of it, but then are you really taking care of the widows and orphans for which that wealth was intended? Jesus has a problem with that. What does that say? It means that not everybody's supposed to give away all their wealth. There are stewardship stories about stewarding the money to do something. But he's got a problem with hoarding the korban. So all of this stuff is a balancing act, right? In reality. If you feed all the hungry people today, what are you going to do tomorrow? You run out. But it's not an excuse. So I've reframed the question here. What does Jesus teach the various believers who claim is their responsibility or duty or obligation to others? Can we begin to see what Jesus is trying to teach as our responsibility? Now I come back to the no collective, because I think there's a reason for that. What are our responsibilities? Who is our neighbor? According to Jesus. Yeah. Anybody who has need, and it's your job to go ferret out that need, not their job to come find you, is the implication. Now, as was said, this is all very personal and social. The horizon's gotten a little bit bigger, but it's not, you should reorganize the Roman government. Why? Because Jesus lives in an occupied Palestine. He is not free to tell the Romans how to run their society. In fact, he demurs that, right? When Pilate says, "Are you king of the Jews?" You've said it. He's trying to avoid this worldly thing. The problem is, of course, Christians we are, as citizens, as voters, as contributors, more in charge of a society than Jesus ever was. So let's go back with the questions. Who is my neighbor? And when did we see you hungry? What do we think are our responsibilities vis-a-vis these questions of Jesus? These pretty simple, how you behave towards others in Jesus's time, and then our more complex social arrangements of personal sphere, a social sphere, and a collective sphere. Yeah.
I would say neighbor, everybody in the world. I understand that. When do we see you hungry? Every day of my life, there's somebody in that neighborhood who's hungry. Problems is, I don't see how I can solve this problem.
Right. And once we move to the collective sphere, and we've added in world hunger and sexual victim trafficking and all this kind of stuff that you can't even get your hands on, where do you start? A lot of people don't even start, or they come up with rationales for not starting. My point about where we are with a lot of churches overemphasizing the personal is because that's manageable, but it leaves so many neighbors out. So I want to recognize that we have this problem, that we're just individual Christians, or we're just a group of Christians in a world of hurt. That's okay. And go to a 1983 wonderful book called Until Justice and Peace Embraced by a Reformed philosopher by the name of Nicholas Wolterstorff, who talks about there are different kinds of Christianities, different kind of philosophies. There are some that say the world is a world of hurt. Our job is to get out of it as quickly as possible, to go off and live with the Christians and behave well as Christians, but not to expect that the world can change. And he's a Reformed, so he's Calvinist. He said there are also world transformative Christians, and you should want to be one of those insofar as you can vote economically. You can buy a hybrid or you can buy a Hummer, right? You can give some of your money to relieve hunger, or you can dine out every night on your own stomach. There are these choices, but how do we make the choices? And he argues that the Christian life, with all of this counsel towards perfection, is a matter of doing something in a positive direction rather than doing nothing. Doing something rather than nothing. And he suggests when you confront that huge circle of concern, to do something that is domestic. He chose hunger. Hungry people in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and New Haven, Connecticut, the two places he was teaching, that he would give of his resources to do hunger. His thing was hunger. Your thing might be abused women and children, orphaned, in effect, are made homeless. You choose your thing. And if we all choose our thing, that will be something that's manageable for an individual to do. He also said, and I also need to do something across the world because I am a world citizen, but I don't have to give everybody 50 cents. In his case, in 1983, because he's Dutch and Reformed, and because South Africa was in such a moment of crisis, he did all he could to support change in South Africa, eliminating legal apartheid, supporting the Christian leaders who were putting that together, Tutu and Bosak, and the new Dutch Reformed Church, which was the under apartheid, that was a colored church, and they led the movement. So, coming back to the circle that you must be getting tired of is responsibility. Where we're going to end up is taking your share without becoming frozen because there's too much to do. You can't get your hands around the whole world, but you can do something. And I think I mentioned in this class, but I certainly mentioned last week when we were talking with the parents of young children, I work with an older group of young people, millennials in the divinity school, who are often very concerned about all the stuff on the outer ring and how awful the world is. You know, it's Darfur one year and it's Ukraine the next, and it's climate change, which keeps rolling, and they've got more skin in it, but they have less resources to deal with it, and they almost turn towards melancholic despair about the world we live in. I think here, then, a rabbi had the right idea, and I'm going to give you two different translations. One is from the Ethics of the Fathers. Rabbi Tarfon used to say, it is not up to you to finish the task, but you are not free to avoid it. What did this mean? And let me give you the other translation, which is, you did not start the task, neither will you finish it, nor may you lay it down. So the idea being, if you're trying to heal the world, tikkun olam, as they say in Hebrew, the healing the world jobs of hungry people, of climate change, of sexual trafficking, of lonely people in your own orbit, the personal responsibility, who is my neighbor stuff, doesn't end, and you won't ever fix it. But you'll be moving in that direction. By fixing it, I mean finish. There'll be lonely people again. The poor will be with you always, says Jesus to Judas. But there is this opportunity to participate in the healing of the world through love of God and love of neighbor. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Just admiring and understand your terms of collective responsibility. I observe in the country today, there's so much division among Christians regarding their own partial feeling that it destroys their collective responsibility. It's apparent.
Yeah, I think,
In large groups, the Methodists are divided. The Baptists are divided. They're more concerned, maybe the Presbyterians are not looking at it together collectively either. But they're all concerned about their individual responsibility of their individual feeling and destroying their collective ability, their collective responsibility.
yeah, I think that's well said. And I think this, who is right about these responsibility questions keeps getting into the situation in which it's like going to one of those restaurants where you keep seeing waiters, but they're never your waiters. You know, it's a situation in which people are so angry with one another's construal of who is my neighbor that nobody's taking care of the neighbors. That's the essence of the moral crisis. When Christians look like hypocrites to people who are, you know, largely younger in our society, what makes them think they should join this group? The only solution to this is when more of those Christians begin engaging in God love and neighbor love in such a way that, like 1 John, who are these people? Is it 1 John, Heidi? Yeah. Say it.
Can't say, I think I got it right, can't say you love God and not love the brother or sister in Christ.
Yeah,
They go together.
they go together. Who are these people that they should love one another? Is the other piece that I was thinking about, the epistle to 1 John. So early in Christianity, they distinguished themselves. They grew because they were remarkably loving towards other people. In fact, we know they were pulling poor people in, and that's the last thing you want to do if you want to have a successful organization. But the Jesus ethic flips things on its head. And I want to wind up and end up by saying, you know, our identity, the solution is to base our identity as Christians we're not like those other Christians, but on something more core. We love God and we love neighbor. Let us show you how we do it. That would be a leading sort of way to truthfully market ourselves by becoming truthful to our sources. And let this be a kind of benedictory prayer. From Psalm 85, it's the second half. And like many Psalms, it's like bad news up front, good news in the back. I'm going to read the good news side, and you can go look at the rest of it. Let this be our prayer. Let me hear what God the Lord will speak. For he will speak peace to his people, to his faithful, to those who turn to him in their hearts. Surely his salvation is at hand for those who fear him, that his glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. The Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before him and will make a path for his steps. The question is, what do we do until faithfulness and righteousness and peace come together? We love God, we love neighbor, and we hope for the day when righteousness and peace come together. Thank you.
That was great. That was very good. That's terrific. One of the issues I struggle with is whether there's such a thing as unconditional love, which is what I would say, or a conditional love. Say, I'm going to give this person a home for 3 months, and you have to leave if you haven't found a job, or on an addiction person, if you can't get off your drugs within so much time, you're going to keep on funding you. And whether the Bible talks anything about how often and how long you should be supporting people who haven't been trying, whatever.
Yeah, so I think Jesus is interesting on this because he talks out of both sides of his mouth. There are these opportunities for people to change, and then the door will close, right? But there's also these sort of, it's probably more than you should love your neighbor more than you are initially prepared to. Then he says you should be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, which would seem like, okay, you got 3 months to get clean and sober. So yeah, I'm working through all this, but that's a very interesting
That's
question.
a tough one. I don't have the answer, but I know people, there are lots of it.
Well, and Susan was pointing to it, which sometimes very evangelical people have the practice of, I've given you a start, but you're on your own after that. And it's
one of the ones
prudential.
When I was on some of the NIH studies, we'd have applications overseas. And they're doing good science. Sending their money to England or to Canada or the United States. And on one hand, you can say, well, it's getting out of that science. Anyway, that's a little bit far off from taking your neighbor. It's sort of the same thing as what you want.
Well, I don't have with vaccines. We've really super emphasized a vaccine that's almost impossible the licensing issue is one thing, But the other issue is just the cost and
The
kind of
temperature, you
production.
have to keep it.
Yeah, although, somebody smart was working on this at Texas Children, so.
I think people are going to come to the occasion of this. Rural vaccinated. You're going to keep
New strains.
It's going to come back and bite you. So I'm hoping that the government is safe. We're going to get a lot of vaccine over to Africa, even for our selfish reasons.
Right, I know.
Right. It's what's so hard is the political climate in which vaccines for Americans.
But anyways, and really enjoyed your talk. Thanks.
Just want to let you know our friend Bill Harkins, this is his last month at Columbia.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I guess we're getting to be that age.
He's
Right?
hanging it up. Well, he's not hanging it up. He's going to do his other vocation jobs. He's got a private.
I was going to say he's a priest. He's an AMFT.
He left St. Louis here ago, Easter. His long-term plan, I think, is to move into Georgia, and he was part of a parish over there, Holy Fan Church.
Yeah,
I think he's still got it.
I think he took that on while I was his team, and we only overlapped for a couple of years.
Yeah, right.
But he came to me. I won't say hat in hand, but I said, okay, if I do this church thing, he said, yes. It looks really good. Somebody.
He has taken this vocation of that where people have told him, we want you full time. And he said, thank you, but no thank you. And he says, my vocation is all these things. I don't have to choose. And he's made it work. And the irony is when we were associate pastor nominating committee, one of the people we interviewed was from Columbia, and was his mentor. And he wanted to do this and this and this. And we didn't know because we think that is a full-time job.
Yeah.
But
And that's
he was looking at Dr. Harkins going, no, I'm a therapist. I want to be in church.
But that church up in North Georgia, couldn't really afford the quality of Episcopal priest, Bill's quality full time. So Columbia got to and his practice got to cross subsidize his ministry. And Heidi's situation is that I'm saying something like only 40 churches above 2,000 in the nation.
I've never been what you said up there. I said it is what the guy said. It's so hopeless. I tend to shrink. I'm not good enough to then go, oh, this or that, expand it. But I'm going to a church who has the resources and needs to do that. And I can do it. That to me is this.
Well, so I wish I'd brought up, Living Waters is a great example of actually doing something global in a very personal way, collectively, because you probably don't have, in this room, we probably don't have the exact right skill set to come up with a water system, but we don't have to. We just have to.
Well, I mean, people
buy some pipe and a plane ticket.
Yeah, for some reason, people come up to me who are going to retire. God, you're retired. It's going to be great. I'm going to volunteer. And I just go, volunteering. So you need to find the right organization, the right support structure. And for me, this church has gotten me an entree into places no way I could have done it. Tutoring in a public high school. I can't just show up at a high school and do that, but I can come in through Westminster, through an organization, various churches. And so there's a whole broker aspect to it, the church. But also, people in this room, Ken Garrison, he goes over to Waverly once a month. I did it once. But I could support the people who do.
I have a schedule, which means I gotta be here most of the time. Because I've got bad lungs, and one thing that we suspect happened to Heidi was mucking out people's houses after the 2010 flood. And then she got fungus in the lungs, which led to the mycobacteria. I'm like, okay, that can't be my thing. Even though it's the thing that's needed, I'll have to
Michael
find something
Kaminsky and
else.
I did that thing. We wore a mask, but it was a poor mask. And afterwards, we said we were going to go straight from the job site to pulmonary rehab. And there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
There's absolutely.
Yeah, well, the day that we did that, I had an asthma attack doing it, so that was all set outside. And then